An electric spark is passed continuously through a mixture of gases such as may have made up the atmosphere when the Earth was new, over 4,000 million years ago. Water vapor is present. The sparks simulate the electrical storms which raged for vast periods of time. Slowly, more and more complex molecules containing carbon are built up. In the bottom of the apparatus they collect. They include complicated organic compounds which are the building bricks from which living organisms build up their even more complex constituents. This primeval soup may have been formed in our ancient oceans. It could have generated the earliest life from which in turn has evolved the enormous variety of animal and plant life on Earth today. In this series of films, we shall be looking at some of the evidence which suggests how the process may have happened, and may still be happening. We shall be examining some of the evidence for the theory of evolution. Dawn over the Grand Canyon, Arizona, USA. A mile down to the Colorado River, which cuts along the inner gorge, and 10 miles wide. Let's look at the kinds of process which created over many millions of years this tremendous gorge. The rocks in the inner gorge were once crushed and distorted into mountains by tremendous earth forces. Then they were gradually worn down by erosion. The sea flooded in. Rivers carried sediments into this calm ocean, which were deposited on the seabed to form eventually a consolidated layer of sedimentary rocks. Then, slow earth movements raised the rock above the sea. The Earth is never still. After millions of years, the level dropped again, and once more a calm sea brought sediments, eventually forming a new deposit of a different rock. The sea retreated again. Sometimes the layer of rock just laid down was eroded away by wind and rain. Then the sea returned again after millions of years, and a different rock was deposited. Remains of some of the living things existing at the time were trapped in all these sediments and preserved as fossils, not just in the Grand Canyon, but anywhere in the world where sedimentary rocks were laid down. The process continued until many layers had been formed, a huge ladder of time with the oldest rock at the bottom and the youngest at the top. Now a slow, gentle earth movement lifted the entire land mass so that the sea fell away. At the same time, a great river, the Colorado, started to cut down into the rocks, like a knife passing through a gigantic layer cake. The process is still going on today. And now the river has reached and cut into those oldest rocks right at the bottom of the canyon, so that many layers of sedimentary rock are exposed along its walls. Let's look at some fossils found in different layers. The river is at present cutting through the Precambrian rocks of the inner gorge, tilted from the time when they were forced up into great mountains. From these rocks, traces of fossil algae, very primitive plants, have been collected. This is how it may have looked in those times. The algae floated on the water surface. Climbing upwards, like those distant mule riders who have clambered out of the inner gorge, we reach sedimentary rocks laid down nearly 600 million years ago. They're exposed at the foot of the outer wall of the canyon, in the bottom right there. Fossil casts of primitive annelid worms have been found here. and the marks left by trilobites. At this time, the Cambrian period, a shallow sea covered the area. Higher up we reach Devonian rocks, laid down about 410 million years ago when this plated fish lived in the sea. Higher still, a limestone layer containing fossilized colonial corals, again telling us of invasion by the sea. From the late Carboniferous, 300 million years ago, a fossil conifer, a much more complex plant than those early algae. Permian sandstone, 250 million years old. Here, on the side of a fallen boulder, animal tracks, the fossilized footprints of an early reptile. Then, the landscape must have looked much like this. Another fossilized track from the same period. Arthropods such as scorpions were living then. Further up the side of the canyon towards younger layers of rock. The Kaibab limestone, about 230 million years old. At this period, the sea again left its evidence, fossil brachiopods, or lamp shells. You can see the two valves. And a complete fossil removed from the rock. We're now at the canyon rim, but there were once rocks above this, laid down even more recently, although still many millions of years ago. Here they've been eroded away by the weather, except for the odd butte, as it's called, like this one. However, these newer rocks from the Mesozoic era can be found in the Painted Desert of northern Arizona. In these rocks we find evidence of far more complex animals. These are dinosaur footprints, the foreleg, the huge hind foot, and the marks left by its claws. Claws like these. Listen to a geologist who works in the Grand Canyon, William Breed.
It is difficult for a geologist to look at these rocks and not to believe in evolution. For at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, where the rocks are old, we only find very primitive algal deposits. And then as we go up the layers from older to younger, we see first trilobites, then fish, then amphibians, and then reptiles. And this is an evolutionary sequence from a more simple animal to a more complex animal.
Here at the University Museum, Oxford, in 1860, there was the famous row with Bishop Wilberforce about evolution. Today, in the nearby Department of Geology and Mineralogy, the probable ages of rocks and of the Earth are being determined by modern physical techniques. A numbered rock sample is first split by applying very high pressure in a specially designed machine. It's broken down further using a hand-operated tool. Then, further still, in a sort of rock mincer. Then finally to a very fine powder indeed. This rock, like many, contains a radioactive isotope which slowly decays over hundreds of thousands of years to form another element. By measuring how much decay has taken place, we can work out the age of the rock. The radioactive isotope in this rock is rubidium-87, which decays by losing a beta particle to form strontium-87. If we can find out how much strontium-87 has been formed and how much rubidium-87 is left, we can work out the age of the rock, because we know the rate at which rubidium-87 breaks down. But rocks contain other isotopes of strontium as well, so we must find out how much of the total strontium is strontium-87. The rubidium and total strontium in the rock are determined by X-ray fluorescence, a standard technique. Then the metals present in several different samples, to allow for error, are converted into soluble chlorides, and the strontium is separated out using an ion exchange column. Even tiny amounts of strontium can be separated out in this way. This is the fraction containing the strontium chloride, and it is evaporated down until it forms only a smear inside the little tube. A mass spectrometer is now used to find out the proportion of strontium-87 present, formed by decay of the rubidium-87. First, the samples must be mounted on tantalum filaments. A drop of phosphoric acid is placed on first as a sort of flux. The smear of strontium chloride is then dissolved in absolutely pure water. And a drop of solution is placed on the flux. The filament is heated electrically, the water evaporates, and strontium chloride is left as a deposit on the filament. The filament, along with others, is placed in the mass spectrometer, the interior of which is evacuated. On applying a current, it heats up, and positive strontium ions stream off the filament along the spectrometer tube. There's a bend in the tube where an electromagnet applies a steadily changing magnetic field. This deflects the ions round the bend, but the degree of deflection depends on the different masses of the ions. So different groups of ions in turn, different isotopes, hit a target at the end of the tube as the magnetic field changes. Each group of ions produces a tiny current which is amplified and measured and is proportional to the amount of each isotope present. The meter and the digital displays show the separate peak currents as they occur, and their values are coded onto punched paper tape. The punched tape, carrying results from several samples of the rock, is fed into a computer into which all the other analytical data has been fed too. Here's the readout. That's the sample we saw being prepared. And the computer calculates for us the age of the rock. "3,707 million years old. This and other rock dating techniques are used by Dr. Stephen Moorbath and his colleagues in this department.
What geochronologists are trying to do is to set up a historical time scale for the physical, chemical, and biological processes that have shaped the surface of the Earth from its beginning to the present time. Many rocks can be dated by these techniques, which actually contain fossils. So if one dates a rock which contains a fossil, then one knows how old the fossil is, how long ago that organism actually lived. This is a particularly interesting rock, and it comes from Rhodesia. It's been dated at about 2,800 million years, and it's one of the oldest known rocks which actually contains fossils. These fossils are the remains of very primitive plants called algal stromatolites, or blue-green algae. most of these samples actually come from Greenland, and they are some of the oldest known rocks on the surface of the Earth. This one's of particular interest here, this sample, and it represents a sediment that was laid down underwater about 3,700 million years ago. And there's a lot of debate going on at the present time whether life existed at the time that these rocks were deposited. And many scientists are currently investigating these rocks to see not so much whether they can find real fossils, but whether they can find organic compounds which have been derived by the breakup of living organisms. So at 3,700 million years ago, it's just possible that life was beginning on this planet.
The film you're watching runs for 20 minutes. Let's suppose that this represents the time since the Earth was formed. Then the last 2,000 years of our history would be a tiny, tiny sliver, too thin to be seen, right at the end of the film. Each frame represents about 130,000 years. And the beginning of man would be about 15 frames from the end of the film, 2 million years, with all this time before he appeared. Interpreting fossil evidence is like trying to piece together the whole film from tiny, occasional broken bits. And of some sequences in the film, there may be no traces at all. Even so, this evidence from the past is very valuable. At the Museum of Northern Arizona, the distinguished American paleontologist, Professor Edwin Colbert.
Now, what is the value of fossils when we're discussing evolution? I think the real importance of fossils is that they bring in the fourth dimension, well, yes, the fourth dimension of time. No other evidence for evolution brings in this time sequence. And in the fossils we have the succession through time of various forms of animals and plants, and we can follow that succession. For example, evolution of the horse is a very famous example of evolution and change through time. Admittedly, there are gaps in the record, but those gaps in some cases are quite inconsequential. I think that's the case in the evolution of the horse. In other cases, there are greater gaps. But even so, I think it's quite valid to project back from one form to another, where we can see the anatomy, the anatomy of the animals changing through the sequence of geologic time. A very good example of this is seen in the evolution of the birds. There's good reason to think now that the birds are descended from the dinosaurs. And we have this famous fossil known as Archaeopteryx, which is an ancestral bird. We have imprints of the feathers in the rock right along with the skeleton, and yet that skeleton, if the feathers had not been found, I think would almost certainly have been classified as a dinosaur. Here we have the evolution of a major group, a major category, you see, and it's preserved in the fossil record.
In the next two films, we shall look in detail at some of these fossil series. We shall see how fossils are discovered and interpreted, and some of the things they tell us about living things in the past, and the light which they throw on living things today. In the last film, we looked at the reconstruction of an early amphibian from its fossilized remains. At Newcastle University Department of Zoology, Dr. Alec Panshin talks about the difficulty of deciding how the first reptiles may have emerged from amphibian ancestors.
If one looks at a reptile, such as a lizard, and then an amphibian, such as a newt or a salamander, the differences between the two aren't so obvious, and it becomes very much worse when you try and go back into the fossil record looking in the Carboniferous period for very early amphibians or reptiles, to say whether any particular fossil you've got is an amphibian or a reptile. For a very long time, people thought that an animal called Seamoria, whose skull we've got here, was not a reptile, but at least a relict, a leftover from the group of amphibians which gave rise to reptiles. Now, there are various technical reasons for saying that this probably isn't so, but if one looks at its skeleton, it's clear that it was a perfectly good land-going animal, but then there are other perfectly good land-going animals at the time, and microsaurs are sort of rivals to the group that Seamoria belongs to as possible reptile ancestors, or at least associated with the origin of reptiles in some way. But again, when one gets to the skull, it's very difficult to say, have we got a reptile, have we got something related to a reptile, and so on. If we look at a living reptile, or at least look at the whole biology of living reptiles, you have then to decide what are the significant features of reptiles. And the overriding one, which we're going to be very lucky indeed to find in fossils, is the particular sort of egg that reptiles and also birds have, which is evolved to be completely independent of water, to hatch and so on land. Now, the chances of finding an egg like that, there are fossil eggs known, but you can't make much of what's inside them. The chance of finding one of those associated with an animal, so that you can say that animal or its relations laid that egg, is almost infinitely small. And so we have to get at things at another way, sort of negative evidence. If one looks at fossil amphibia, early fossil amphibia from the Carboniferous and Permian periods, you often find that they have grooves on the skull. And these grooves contain what are known as lateral line canals. They are sense organs that an animal uses when it's living most of its time underwater. And so as a first approximation, we could start off with, say this: if we find a fossil which has got these lateral line canals, which it's inherited from its fish ancestors, then it's almost certainly not a reptile. An even better test, but a more difficult one to apply, is if an animal had a tadpole, then it didn't have the amniote or cleidoic egg. It therefore is an amphibian. And we have, in fact, in some fossil amphibia, a creature where we've got growth stages, where it has little gills when it first hatches, and then you can see successive larger and larger specimens in which the gills finally disappear. So that, emphatically, is not a reptile. And you can then apply a sort of principle of guilt by association and say that anything closely related to it, and certainly anything which is descendant from it and has the same sort of characters, belongs to the same group, is not a reptile either. So that gets us a bit further forward. And then, then saying what is a fossil reptile becomes a very negative sort of thing. The little skull of Romeria is that generally agreed to be that of a fairly early and very primitive reptile, but it is entirely on this sort of negative judgment. It hasn't got any of these amphibian characters. It didn't have in any stage of its life history, as far as we know, lateral line canals. It didn't have a tadpole, and it's got what paleontologists call a reptiliomorph skeleton, one which is obviously that of a land-living animal. And then after that, one stuck with a sort of theory of, well, this sort of animal may have given rise to later reptiles. There's nothing to debar it from having done so. And that's about as near as one can get.
Whatever the details of their origins, reptiles were important animals at the start of the Mesozoic era 225 million years ago. Here, in the petrified forest region of northern Arizona, there are many fossil reptile remains. Dr. Richard Cifelli.
We've just discovered something here. It's a little bit premature to tell what it is exactly. But I'm working it back with the dental tools, a standard tool of paleontologists, and chisels and paintbrush, and you work it back very carefully and squirt glue on the bone. This is very watered down glue. It's important to get enough glue into the bone so that it soaks it up and doesn't fall apart. This appears to be a large enough specimen so that we'll probably have to jacket it, that is, put some plaster support so it doesn't fall to pieces on the ride back to town.
Recent weathering has exposed a little of the fossil, and Dr. Cifelli must uncover it completely before trying to remove it. It's the jawbone of a phytosaur, one of a group of carnivorous reptiles of the Triassic period.
I've got the fossil covered with the surgeon's bandages now, and I'm going to put sacking over top of that for added strength. The sacking is thoroughly covered with plaster of Paris, a technique which has been used for well over 100 years among paleontologists. Well, this side's just about done now. I'm just smoothing down the last of the plaster. We'll give it about 20 minutes to set, and then flip the fossil over very carefully so that pieces don't fall out the other side, and then jacket that too. It'll make a complete cast around the whole fossil.
After a lot of work in the great heat of the desert, the fossil, plastered up and splintered, can at last be taken away for work in the laboratory at the Museum of Northern Arizona in Flagstaff. The USA and Canada are very rich in fossil remains of this kind.
Well, we brought the specimen back to the lab where we can prepare it under controlled conditions. These things have a remarkable tendency to fall apart. And what I'll be doing here is using the vibrator saw and cutting the jacket around the margin here, and then gradually trying to pry it off. Okay, I've got the jacket removed now, and we've got some minor breakage here. That these pieces get glued back down, and we'll remove all the rest of the matrix from around the bone and take the paper off, etc.
The fossil is finally cleaned up. There are the tooth sockets. They carried the sharp, peg-like teeth typical of many reptiles. And here's what the animal must have looked like, reconstructed from many fossil remains which have been excavated and cleaned up. Here at the Museum of Northern Arizona, another reconstruction, Pentaceratops, a horned dinosaur from the Cretaceous period, between 136 and about 65 million years ago. This is its skull. Its jaws became skewed sideways after death. It's upside down, by the way. There are big, blunt teeth, showing that it was a herbivore, a plant eater. Fossilized plants, such as it might have fed on, were found with the skull, a leaf, another plant, and another, and a thick stem. Not only can we reconstruct extinct animals from fossil fragments, we can also in some cases discover what they ate, how they lived from fossil evidence. Reptiles, including the dinosaurs, were dominant animals for many millions of years, until about 60 million years ago, when the age of the mammals arrived. At the British Museum of Natural History in London, some fossils illustrating the possible derivation of mammals from early reptiles. This is Cynognathus, an early reptile which lived about 200 million years ago. Here's its fossil skull. Look at the teeth. They show heterodonty, teeth of more than one type. This mammal-like reptile had stabbing canine teeth, and behind, chewing teeth, showing the beginning of cusps. A later mammal-like reptile, Proboscidon. Heterodonty again. And if we look underneath, there's a secondary palate, typical of mammals. These fossil reptiles illustrate how true mammals, like this wolf, may have evolved. Mammals have incisors, canines, premolars and molars, and a true secondary palate. Fossil evidence shows that mammals became dominant animals in comparatively recent times, in the Tertiary period, starting about 60 million years ago. In New York again, at the American Museum of Natural History, there are some very important fossil series illustrating evolution amongst the mammals. The Titanotheres. Earl Manning of the museum's staff.
The Titanotheres are a group of mammals that lived from a period of 50 million years ago till about 30 million years ago. And during this time, they evolved from rather small, browsing animals to quite large, almost rhinoceros-like animals at the time of their extinction about 30 million years ago. And what you see when you look at the evolution of this group is the evolution of very peculiar head ornament. You can see the evolution of these horns in a very sort of gradual way because the record is so good for Titanotheres. You start out with tiny little bumps over the eyes of the animals. And the bumps get larger and larger in younger and younger forms. Till finally, in the ones about 30 million years ago, the horns become quite enormous. There's quite a bit of variety in these different sorts of horns. You have very large horns in the more specialized forms, which it's now thought were probably used in the same way that giraffes use their horns for wrestling with each other. The males would put their heads together and wrestle back and forth. Or sometimes it's thought, in any case, that the individuals would butt the flanks of the other animal, but there wasn't a sort of head-on ramming. When you see these large, impressive horns, you sometimes think of them coming at each other, but presumably that's not the case. There's quite a bit of difference between different sorts of Titanotheres, particularly in the more specialized versions that were the later forms. The American ones have two horns sort of sweeping forward in a gentle curve, and the Mongolian and Chinese ones have a very different sort of arrangement, where there's sort of one large horn sweeping up in the front, presumably with some sort of long proboscis, or a nose at least, way high on the end of the horn. Both of these groups died out around 30 million years ago. Why they became extinct is unclear, but they did about that time, and there are no living relatives of them.
A mammal which is not extinct, the fossil record of the evolution of the horse.
The fossil horses have an extremely good record. They were one of the first groups of fossils that was used as evidence by the people who first came up with the idea of evolution, and Huxley in particular, as an example of an actual sequence of animals evolving. The record of the horses is so good because there is complete deposition in America at that time. So there's an unusually complete sequence. You can see very small changes from one type of horse to another. They start out as very small, browsing animals, presumably living in jungles.
Hyracotherium, or Eohippus, the dawn horse, a small animal about the size of a large terrier dog, which lived about 50 million years ago. Look at the foreleg. There are 4 toes. The skull. The teeth have quite low crowns, suggesting that they were not subject to much wear during the animal's lifetime. It must have fed on soft vegetation. Here's a fossil tooth. Mesohippus, a little bit bigger, from the Oligocene, maybe 35 million years ago. Only 3 toes on the foreleg, and the central one is becoming slightly enlarged. The teeth have slightly higher crowns. A Miocene horse from about 26 million years ago. It's quite definitely bigger. The side toes no longer reach the ground, and the central toe is much stronger looking for speed in running. These animals lived in grassland and had teeth with higher crowns to accommodate greater wear because of the coarser vegetation which they ate. A Pliocene horse from about 5 million years ago, again a bigger animal. The central toe has become much nearer to the hoof of the modern horse, and this would have been a speedy beast. The teeth are very much longer to last a lifetime of feeding on coarse grasses. Look at the high crown. A later Pliocene specimen, bigger still and very near to Equus, the modern horse. The hoof, which was once a central toe, and the side toes have degenerated into long, thin splint bones down the back of the leg, vestigial structures. And there are much longer teeth. The teeth are, in fact, very similar to those of the modern horse. The fossil sequence shows clearly how the hoof, amongst other features, has evolved. The fossil record for the horse presents striking evidence for a process of evolution from form to form. In Flagstaff, at the Research Center of the Museum of Northern Arizona, Professor Edwin Colbert again, on the importance of the fossil evidence for evolution.
Darwin, I think, wrote about the incompleteness of the fossil record, but it's interesting that since Darwin's time, the gaps have been filled in many cases, so that the record, even though there are some gaps, is rather complete in many instances. So I think that holds up and corroborates the validity of the fossil evidence. And of course, even where the fossil evidence is incomplete, we have other evidence among living animals for evolution that fleshes it out, that brings in the missing parts. So I think it all ties together.
In the films which follow, we shall look at some of this other evidence and see what it tells us about the relationships between living things and the processes of change which are still continuing today.